Welcome to Supreme Ruler Ultimate. Today I'm going to give you a guide on how the economy works in this game, as well as touch upon how it affects your finances. So I've booted up a game here. It's January 1st, 2020. Just started the modern day scenario. I picked the US so that if you go through this, you will see exactly what I see if you want to go along with the guide. So the first thing that I'd like to point out is my favorite screen for keeping track of your most basic and easy to digest economic info, and that's right here on the State tab. This is my favorite, despite that it doesn't show a lot of things, because you can quickly click on different countries and see how they're all doing economically. Now, one of the first things that you'll notice is the bar. When I click around different countries, the bar changes. This bar isn't representative of how well your economy is doing. This bar is just comparing your overall economic power to other countries. Full bar meaning the person with the highest relative economic power, and empty bar meaning the person with the lowest relative economic power. When we hover over this bar, we're going to see we have access to some information. Now, this can all be found on the actual finance screen, but let's talk about it here while we're looking at easy to digest information. So the Treasury, which is also visible here for any country, shows the amount of money that you have ready to spend. This can include just net money that you've made, or it can include money that also comes from debt. You can see actually little warning signs on a region right here at the Treasury, including some other places, if they have debt. Now, I'm sure many of you are coming into this with massive misconceptions about how the economy, debt, and finances work in the government, and if you haven't already seen my geopolitical simulator economic guide, I go very in-depth about it there. This game doesn't work one-to-one with real life. There's some gamey aspects to the economy, but I will point those out as we get to them. The next thing that we can see here is debt. This is the amount of money that you have taken out and then put into your treasury that you now owe back. This does not include interest, and it will never include interest. Interest payments are actually done directly in this game. After 1 year of having a debt payment pulled out of the bank where you got it from, it takes the interest payment and subtracts it from your treasury, and that's a payment for a service. It doesn't raise your debt. Your debt is a set amount based on the exact amount you have borrowed. And in the modern day scenario, everyone starts out with some debt values to show how much they have pulled out historically. That's why I chose to do this in modern days, so we could also talk about debt, since all the other scenarios, when you go back in history, most of them don't even have debt enabled, but the ones that do don't have any debt to start with. Next, we have credit rating. Credit rating is basically how much the bank thinks that you are a valuable person. You should know this from real life. It works very similar to real life. The higher your credit rating, and it can go up to 150%, the more money you will be allowed to take out as debt to put into your treasury. The less credit rating you have, the less you'll be able to take out, until eventually you get so low, around 2 or 3%, that they just don't let you take out any anymore. And the lower your credit rating, the more you have to pay in interest to keep that debt out. So debt is best taken out when you are at 150% credit rating, because then you will have to pay the least amount of interest payments on it. Next is inflation, and now this is going to be the most frustrating part to teach you guys, because inflation in this game does not work like you might think it does in real life. And if you watched any of my playthroughs on this game so far, then you'll be well aware of this. I'll actually put those playthroughs in the cards, have them pop up right around now or at the beginning of the video, and you can watch those, because I do a lot of teaching about this game in those. But talking about inflation right now, you have to understand, in this game, they chose to simplify things, dumb it down a little bit. So in this game, inflation is not just tracking the price of goods and all that. It's actually also tracking your economic growth. I skipped over GDP per capita while going through this list because it ties very heavily with inflation in this game, and I want to go over it. So in real life, you might know that as GDP goes up, inflation affects the value of the dollars in that GDP. Well, that's not quite how this works here. In this game, since economic growth is tied with inflation, as your inflation goes up, not only do the prices of services and labor and goods go up as well, but your GDP per capita goes up as well. They are tied 1-to-1 instead of being realistic separate demographics. In the Supreme Ruler Ultimate Wiki, they actually explain that a healthy inflation is 3%. Anything more is bad, and anything less is an underperforming economy. And now this is somewhat true in real life, but in this game, it's not quite the case. The only way to increase the overall wealth of your population and your economy is to raise your inflation or keep it sustained at a positive number over time. And now this is important because the higher the GDP per capita of your country, the more money you earn from taxes. Or this is inversely important because the lower your GDP per capita, the cheaper goods and services are, and thus the more profit you can make selling goods like resources to other countries. It depends what your main source of income is going to be, and we can touch upon that later. It really depends on your strategy, but technically in this game, since growth and inflation are tied together, there is no real bad rate of inflation, but there are bad effects from certain amounts of inflation. So let's start with the obvious. If you go into a deflation in this game, that means your GDP per capita is going to go down, meaning you will get less income from taxes. But this also means that the cost of goods is going to go down and make you more competitive as well in the global market. A high inflation, and we're talking it can go really, really high, up to 20% even. The higher it gets, the more money your population will have, the more money you can make in taxes, the more that your population is capable of paying for goods that you produce domestically. So it's an inverse to the global market, as you can see. So if you are going to be dependent on selling goods abroad, a lower inflation, maybe even a deflation, I would recommend just a lower inflation though, because the price of goods and how much you can make selling things is actually relative to the GDP per capita of every country in the world, as opposed to just being internal. If you are going to try to make most of your money off of taxes or by selling things to your population specifically, hell, you can rely on importing. You don't even have to produce the goods. Then you want a higher inflation. You want a higher GDP per capita. Although you do have to be careful, because as inflation goes up, the prices for everything goes up as well. And if your primary source of income doesn't provide you enough money for your treasury, then it can be hard to maintain higher inflation rates. And that's the point of keeping them more in the middle, somewhere between, in this game's terms, 2 and 6 or 7%. And this leads me to the next part of this information sheet, and that is unemployment. Now, most individuals I found don't even know what unemployment is. Raise your hand if you think unemployment means the amount of population in the country that is unemployed. If you raised your hand, you're wrong. Unemployment in real terms means the amount of population that is actively seeking a job compared to the overall amount of active workers in the workforce. If you don't understand what that distinction means, basically, being unemployed does not put you in the unemployment demographic. In fact, it just considers that you do not exist in the economy at all. Someone that is in the unemployment statistic is someone that in the past 6 months, let's say, has actively applied to a job, and it's not comparing them to you, the unemployed, it's comparing them to everyone else that already has a job. So if there is a 4.7% unemployment rate, as we are seeing here, that means that when you include the amount of potential workers that want work, but there aren't jobs available for them or jobs they're willing to take, then 95.3% of the total demographic there, including active workers, are employed, whereas these 4.7% are trying to seek employment. The way it works in real life is what is the basis for what it affects in this game. So the average person, and raise your hand if this is you, thinks that a lower unemployment is better. Well, that depends who you ask. But for a country, no, and lower employment is not better. Lower unemployment has terrible effects on the economy that I'm going to share with you so that you can run your country like a politician and not the average person that likes seeing lower numbers. Now, the reason lower unemployment is worse is because lower unemployment means, as the potential workforce goes down, that employers, for example, this could be the government or companies, needs to pay more for every individual person they hire. And now you might wonder, well, that sounds great. Getting paid more for the same work because there's enough jobs available. How could that be bad? Well, because that leads to inflation, which leads to rising costs for goods and services, which spends more money, which leads to more inflation. And that's how you end up with hyperinflation. The lower your unemployment gets, it encourages your inflation to grow even further. The further your inflation goes, the more everything costs. And even if your plan was to get a high GDP per capita as soon as possible, this can create a ballooning effect that will make it so that you can't afford anything, even when including your growing tax income, just because the inflation, the prices are growing too rapidly. And now, for unemployment in this game, 3%. Remember that number. 3% is what you do not want to get unemployment under. Once it gets under that, that's when you'll start noticing an even bigger change to the prices of things, and that might hurt your treasury, which is the one thing you might have been trying to help by having a high inflation to get a higher growth. This all sounds really weird when you know real life economics, but stay with me because this just gamifies a lot of things to make them simpler. Now, let's finish off this screen by looking at the final economic thing on this little tab here, which is tourism. So tourism it's a representation of how much someone else living in another country wants to come to your country. And this is important for your economy because they're taking money from somebody else's economy, essentially, and bringing it to your economy. And you didn't have to do anything to make it happen, technically speaking. Now, what effect that has in this game is a realistic effect. This is actually a modifier for your inflation. So tourism is something that you technically don't directly, but indirectly, pay for that boosts your inflation passively. There is no tourism slider, and there is no one thing you can do to affect tourism. Tourism is affected by a lot of things. I'll get into the more financial/economic things when we get to them, but other things that I won't really cover too in depth here is if you are at war a lot, then your tourism will go down because nobody wants to go to a war-torn hellhole. If you have a dictatorship, communism, or some other less free form of government, that will also reduce your tourism because nobody wants to go to your shitty backhole country. Otherwise, the only other way outside of spending money to boost tourism is a building that's pre-placed in different parts of the map. I've zoomed in on Washington, D.C. here to show you. You can see it on this little list here, the tourist attraction, or on the land tab, you can see it right here, a tourist attraction. These are spread throughout the map, and they artificially increased your tourism rates for free. They don't cost you any money. They don't cost you anything. It's just because it's a historical or important location that often gets visited in real life. The devs have placed these tourist attractions here. They're very important for boosting tourism and helping grow your economy if you have them, and lacking them can be a hindrance to your treasury and to your economy, because when your tourism relies mostly on these attractions, then you're not only getting free economic growth, free inflation, you're getting free money as a result. Now, before we move on to the finances screen, there's a couple other things that I would like to talk about here. Inflation, economic growth, and all that stuff in this game is primarily affected by government spending because there's no free market simulation necessarily. You, in some way, control everything. And so there's a number of factors that affect this other than government spending, which we'll get to, such as your domestics here. all you need to get out of this screen is whether or not you have a positive population growth, and this is also affected by whether or not you are taking countries over. The higher your population gets, and especially the faster it grows, which includes if you suddenly annex China, then your economic growth, your inflation will start going down, potentially into a deflation, as you try to take a large population potentially and integrate them into your economy using your dollar. You're not going to get the GDP per capita of another country when you take it over because they're using a different currency. And the population entering your economy by being born or by immigrating is not going to show up super rich or anything and make that much of a difference. No, so inflation can be controlled and actually kept in a more stable place, and this includes your unemployment especially, and its effect on inflation, by having a positive and especially higher population growth. But you have to be careful because that same thing can actually reduce your inflation later in the game, and then you can run into money issues that way if you rely on a higher GDP per capita. Oh, and also your domestic approval rating here, which is affected by all sorts of things, war, taxes, social spending, which we'll get to. This also affects how much you earn by taxes. The more your population likes you, the more they are willing to pay in your taxes. Your taxes can be increased without changing a slider, simply by making your population happier, because then less of them will tax evade. They'll be more on top of making sure they pay you everything they owe you. And so, as you see, there's different ways to gain income through taxes. Either go really, really high by oppressing your population, or go lower. There's even zero tax strategies, which is an opposite to my usual max tax strategy, where you make your population so happy that they will, even if they don't have to pay you any taxes, spend more money on goods in your economy. Speaking of goods in your economy, let's go look at the resources screen. Now, goods of your economy are affected by a lot of things, and one important thing to note is if you rely on selling things, especially within your own economy, as opposed to taxes, that will actually further raise your inflation. So going closer to a zero tax strategy as opposed to a max tax strategy actually gives you the benefit of more economic growth. Now, this can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on your economic situation. If your inflation is too high, you might want to end up raising taxes. If your inflation is really low, well then lowering taxes and trying to get your money by selling goods here. As you can see, there is a domestic price for goods. By selling goods instead, that will actually boost your inflation and maybe get you into a healthier economic position. Now, this is a economic and finance tutorial here. This is not going to go into how all the resources work, but I'm going to cover little bits of this screen. Most importantly, you have your production costs. This is determined by your current inflation rate total, not just the 4% rate that you see when you check the information. This is determined by your entire GDP per capita, your entire gameplay or history of inflation will determine this cost. This is how much it takes to make 1 unit of a product. And these numbers here roughly resemble the units. This is the market price. This is the price of the good on the world market, and it can be sold around this price, and that will lower or raise the price. It's a good comparison to see, hey, is this profitable to sell? And now that depends on if you are actually going into these tabs and selling things yourself and buying things yourself, or if you're letting your AI do it, or if you've given your AI any cabinet priorities. I can make a tutorial on that stuff if you want to know later, but this tutorial is already going to be a long one, so let's stay on topic. The industry controls here, which you can go to by clicking on any industry here and then clicking this button right here, the second one down. It shows you a lot of information for your resources, but the only one that really matters for this guide is the domestic price here, the domestic markup. So if you are a low GDP per capita country, you'll profit very heavily from selling your goods abroad, and your goods will be very cheap to sell. As a result, maybe you don't want to sell as many to your population. Well, you could try to raise your prices so that everyone pays more, so that you're making roughly the same amount of profit as you're making from exporting. However, this makes your goods harder to afford, and this makes it so that your population becomes unhappy. It will also artificially reduce demand. So you see your production and actual usage numbers and bars here. The usage will go down, and so you'll have more production to sell abroad. That's one thing to do. Now, if you're playing a country like the United States, where your GDP per capita is so high that usually making a lot of things isn't too profitable, then your own citizen is actually your best market. So it's within your best interest to lower your taxes so that they have the ability to buy more stuff, because as your taxes are lowered, that also raises the usage, as opposed to artificially lowering it by raising the prices. And you can also lower the prices to stimulate demand even further. And as you see, even if I do let's see, like a 20% markup here, my domestic price is $2.39 per unit of oil, whereas the market price is $2.12. That's because my production price is $200. It's relative to my production price. It's actually much, much more profitable to sell this good to my population. And now that leads to situations where you may not even want to be producing any goods. You might find goods like rubber, where it's so much more expensive for you to make the rubber than it is to buy it. So you might just decide to, stop your minister from really taking control of it, turn off production of it, and then actually just buy rubber instead, because then you're going to save money, a lot of money. Because remember, this is coming from your money. And now if this was a good like timber, then you could actually make money by, instead of making your own timber, for example, you could import it at the lower prices and then sell to your own population at a higher price. And that's just another way to deal with the economy over here on resources. Now that you know how to view your general economic information, and now that you know how your resources will affect your economy, it's time to look at the big meat of this tutorial, which is going to be how your finances affect your economy and vice versa. I know we've already covered some of this, but let's take a look at what we have here on the finance screen, the most important screen for managing your economy. So right here, little like White House, you have a lot of the same information we had on the state screen, but it's specific to your country. We have our GDP per capita, our overall tax rate, which isn't something you really need to look at here. It's better to look at the individual taxes. This is just a combination of them. You have your inflation, you have your unemployment, we've been over those. You have your population, which is also findable on the domestics bar of the state tab, but that's not too important of a statistic all by itself. You have the world GDP per capita average, and there are other ways to check this. In fact, there's a lot of information you could check just by coming up here to the regional atlas at the top left, making sure you're on the domestic screen here, and then you have your treasury, you have debt you could sort by, GDP per capita per country, population, all of this, but I'll let you explore that on your own time in the game. It's a lot of the same information I'm explaining, it's just a different way to see it. And this is another way to see your GDP ranking in the world, which when you know offhand roughly the amount of countries there are in the world, you know where that puts you. Are you going to be an importer? Are you going to be an exporter? Should you be relying on taxes, or should you be relying on exporting things? Now under that we have daily income and we have daily expenses. As we hover over, we can see some things of where our money is coming from. We can see some examples of where our money is going, and we can see our surplus and deficit here to show us, is our budget making us money? Is it losing us money? Now, don't take that as a, should I be making money right now? Because another thing that matters is your last day trades. The last day trades here, and there's another way to look at all this information, actually, it's this right here, the previous day trades. You could also sort by dollars. You can see what's making you money in your economy in terms of resources, what's losing your money. And you can use this as a way to figure out, what do I need more of? What do I need to find a way to import? Things like that. It also shows you your treasury number again, and whether or not you have a notable debt level. And now you can change these values, by the way. If you click up here, it says showing daily figures. Now watch down at the bottom left. You can see it changes from daily income and expenses to annual income and expenses, and the surplus and deficit changes to match that as well. This is a preference thing. One may be easier for you to manage, one may be harder. The last day trades stays the same, so you can get up-to-date information on how your exports and imports are doing on a day-by-day basis. Now we're going to go down these little tabs here on the right as I explain them to you. So this is the cabinet. This is where you can assign cabinet priorities to have your AI help you manage things. I don't usually use these because I'm better than the AI, and hopefully after this guide you will be too. This right here is a list of every bond you have, and in most starting scenarios you will start out with no bonds or debt taken out. Just the modern day has historical ones, but there's settings to turn this off completely if you don't like dealing with debt. The rate here tells you the amount of interest you have to pay when the date here reaches an anniversary. The amount here is the amount that you borrowed in one go, and the rate is based off that amount. So you can also probably see this easier if you come over here to the expense report and you go to Treasury. It'll have the loan repayment, and this might be easier to keep track of with the annual figures, but generally speaking, that's how that works. This is what you borrowed. This is how much of it you will pay out of your pocket when the 1 year anniversary every year of this date rolls around. There's overall spending and tax rate here. This is for your social spending. This is for your actual tax rate. You can raise these here if you don't want to go down here and manually adjust them one by one. But honestly, I would never do this. I would always do it one by one, and you'll see why. These buttons are just ways to lock your minister off from interfering in your economy if you don't want your minister interfering in, taxation, social spending, taking out debt. That's a big one. Or this one's more particular, whether or not he will manage facility repairs and constructing buildings. If you ever have a problem with things repairing when you don't want them to, or buildings being made that you didn't tell them to build, this is why they're building, this is why they're repairing. Lock this off if you don't want the minister taking care of things like that. I personally would recommend locking it off. All right, now we go into the income report. So let's start up here with state. The state income will show you how much money you are gaining in income either every day or every year based on what you have set in foreign aid, which is as if someone had supported your government. For example, hopefully you know what this is, but if I click on another country and I go to influence relations and I support their government, this costs money. And so this money is actually going to go into that country's state income. They will see that income here. They won't see who sent it, but they will see that someone is granting them that kind of stuff here. And trade received is as if I went and I made a trade deal where I gave someone, let's say I turned it on to like per 90 days, and I made it so that I was giving them, I don't know, this much. And so every day they'd be able to see this income right in that slot there under trade received. Next, treasury. You're going to see your taxes here, of course, is where all your tax income unified is going to be. There's a lot of places to see the tax income, though. These other two don't really matter, and you're not ever going to see them anyway, so let's skip to production. Domestic sales. This is really easy. So whenever you sell something to your population, as I showed you in the resource tab, and that's why I took care of that first, this is where it shows. Although I want you to understand very clearly, this is not your profits from selling goods. This is the flat amount of money that you were given for the goods. This does not subtract or include in any way the cost of the goods. If you actually look at expense report, there's a production thing here that shows you how much you spent on the goods. So to actually figure out if you're profiting by selling domestically, especially with production, although that might be hard to tell because you might be selling some goods, so you have to take your trades into account as well, which your trades don't reflect in your budget surplus deficit, by the way. It does affect your treasury, but it doesn't reflect in your surplus deficit. You'd have to look at how much am I spending on production, how much am I earning from production, and how much am I earning from trades. There is sadly nothing here that directly combines this to do math for you, so this is just something you have to keep track of yourself. The rest of this is research and income, and I'm not going to lie, I don't even think you can make money from this. I certainly don't know how. So if you know how, leave it in the comments below, because as far as I know, these are only expenses, which, as you can see here, we have our research expenses, which is just stuff you set over here on the research screen. I could talk about that in a different tutorial maybe. And same thing here with defenses. This is what you're spending on your unit production. So for all the units you're making in your unit fabrications, your preparedness, which is actually automatically set by the AI, but can be influenced based on priorities you give, and your standing military, which includes troops that you have deployed. It includes military servicemen that are in buildings that you have. This includes airports, this includes seaports, not airfields and sea piers. This includes military bases and all other kinds of military structures is what this comes from. And then we have the treasury, which shows you the social services spending, which we will get to more specifically. It shows how much money you're spending in the past day or, the whole year on constructing things, which only happens when you're building new facilities. There's the facilities payments themselves, which this is your maintenance, either daily or annual, on your facilities that are placed throughout the world. There's your loan repayment. That has more to do with trades, just like the loan principal here does, but you're honestly never going to experience that ever. I've never been in a situation where I've really experienced it. You have to make bad trade deals to even get in that situation anyway. Interest is here I took a bond and this is the amount of interest I need to be paying. That's what that is. And then overdraft interest is I need to pay it, but I didn't have enough money to pay it, so now I have to pay even more. This is what I owe now from that, and that's a really bad situation to be in. And finally, going back to the top here, state expenses. So you have intelligence here. This is just a government expense. It's about your spies, your facilities for counter-espionage. That's what this is. UN membership. This is a base fee for being a part of the UN, or not the UN in the earlier ones. In the earlier scenarios, I think it's the League of Nations, but it will still say UN membership. This is not something you can really avoid paying, but there is a subsidy rate thing based on how powerful you are, how nice you are, especially how many positive trade deals and political deals you make around the world. The UN will actually subsidize your membership fee, and that is the way to lower your amount of payments, and it can get pretty damn close to 100%. I don't think I've ever seen it at 100%. So if you're a good person and you don't go around starting wars, and even if you help those that have been declared war on falsely, if you have 100% justification, and especially if it's your ally, these are ways to lower your UN membership fee. This directly affects your financials, so I thought I'd explain it. I've already explained the last day traits. Let's start going down to taxation. So we have a whole lot of taxes here, as you can see, and they all have different effects on your economy, but they all grant you money. I'm going to try to explain them one by one as simply as I can. One important thing to remember before I start explaining any of this is that your taxes are affected by your GDP per capita directly, and your inflation can change these values no matter what tax rate you set, as well as your domestic approval rate. And do note, every single one of these taxes lowers your domestic approval rate. So as you raise percentages, you can find situations where your tax income doesn't raise as much as you thought it would, because as your population gets unhappier from the higher taxes, they end up finding ways to pay less. Now, low income taxes, that is the poorest of your society. Those the ones that, need the money the most. There's a lot of them, so it results in a lot of money. So you would be hard pressed to find ways to not tax them, but it is possible. I've done it. This tax will hurt your domestic approval rating a lot more than a lot of the others. There's a little minor effect where you can actually get a tiny, I don't want to say boost, but more of a makeup for domestic approval rating if you leave this tax lower than the next one, which is the high income tax. The bigger the gap in percentage, the bigger the boost. But do note, just by having these taxes anyway, you're reducing the domestic approval rating anyway. But this is the high income tax bracket, let's call it. This is taxing your high earners. Could be owners of companies, who knows? They have a lot of money, and so they have a lot of money to tax. This can change based on the overall wealth of your economy, but as you can see, high income can net a lot more money in this game than low income can. High income taxes do not hurt your domestic approval rating as much, but high income taxes actually have a more detrimental effect on your inflation rate and thus your GDP per capita than low income, because the high earners are usually the owners of the companies and stuff that keep your economy rolling. Speaking of that, we go into corporate and small business taxes. These have probably the highest impact on your inflation out of any of the taxes. The higher these are, the bigger your inflation will drop. This can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on what you're trying to do. They don't net as much money as the high income taxes or the low income taxes. These are more like extra taxes on things. Corporate taxes have a smaller domestic approval rating hit than small businesses do, because of course the small businesses are more tied to your low income, whereas the corporate is more tied to your high income. The lower these taxes, the more your economy benefits, but especially these ones. And then there's sales taxes. Sales taxes don't have nearly as much of a domestic approval rating hit as the income taxes do. And what they actually do is, we go back over here to the resources and we look at, for example, selling timber to the population. You're actually taxing the price of which you are selling goods to your population. So if you want to weed out income taxes, for example, you could get higher or even lower prices on goods. Lower prices means happier population, means they'll be actually buying more goods. And then a way you can still try to get that income from selling more goods is by having sales taxes. Because as you stimulate demand in your economy, which stimulates growth, your sales taxes can be a way for you to reel in all that money in a way that doesn't upset everybody as much. This is a very right-wing / conservative fiscal policy thing to do, as opposed to, you know, in this case, if you wanted to play more left-leaning, you just raise the income taxes, lower the sales taxes, raise the price of goods, and cut out the middleman, but upset your population more in the process. The final three taxes I just like to call the miscellaneous taxes, because they don't actually affect very much. Unemployment is a tax intended to fund the unemployed sector and unemployment benefits. This tax applies to pretty much everybody and nobody likes it at all. It's definitely a good one to cut when you're starting to cut through them, although it's not the worst. The worst two taxes that stand by themselves that are easy to cut are actually property tax, which doesn't earn you a whole lot to begin with, and pension tax. Now, the property tax, if I were you, is the first one I would cut if I cut any of them, because the rates themselves aren't very much, the income isn't very much, and this not only has the downside of upsetting your poor and high-income population because you're taxing their homes, you're taxing their properties in general, but property taxes also affect your economy heavier than anything except for small business and corporate taxes do here, because you're also taxing the storefronts. So lowering property tax is not just a way to make your whole population happy, it's also a way to boost your economy in a greater sense than most of these other taxes could do with the same amount of money lost in your sense in this case. Pension taxes are another tax that applies to everybody, just like unemployment, and everybody hates it. The whole point is to fund social spending. Pension tax and unemployment taxes don't really have a strong effect on your economy, but they do have a huge effect on your domestic approval rating, which we've already been over what effects those have. Now, social spending. Oh boy, is this one complicated. Let's start with explaining how these work in general, because unlike taxes where it's a simple bar where the higher you go, the more you make, social spending works differently. The optimum amount of spending for the max amount of benefit there's two of them. The first is to put it in the middle of the bar, which you can do by double tapping on the bar. That will immediately put it in the center. This is your original optimal rate without any technologies boosting your capabilities here whatsoever. One thing you'll notice when your percentage of quality rating here, which takes time, by the way, it's not instant like changing a tax rate. As it goes up, it can start to go above 100%. The money saved from technologies, for example, is your ability to lower the spending to hit 100% without meeting the original recommended, as you can see here, rate that it defaults to when you double tap the center of the bar. However, that does not mean that there is no point to double tapping the center of the bar, because now there is a mechanic where you can spend more than the original recommended amount. Now, if you have the original values without the text, that's a way to get over 100% to gain some bonuses in all of these areas. When you have technologies that make these things cheaper, then you can get those bonuses at the center of the bar here, as opposed to raising it. Because when you do raise it past the center of the bar, you end up spending a lot more money and only gaining a few more percentage points. And there's very few reasons to do that, except if you really need a specific bonus from one of these fields. Whereas with the technologies, if you keep it in the middle of the bar, instead of at the 100% quality rating, you're actually getting your full money's worth, as if this beyond 100% quality rating point was within the natural spending anyway. This is a very hard thing to explain, so if you have any questions about this, leave them in the comments below. I know your brain's probably hurting. I'll answer as many questions as I can from you guys. Now, let's talk about what these all actually do. Healthcare is pretty obvious. This is the healthcare system of your country. The better the quality rating, the less likely anybody is to die, and the more likely someone is to be born successfully. This is a very important thing to have funded to raise your population, but also to keep your population happy. Because, if everyone's dying and no one's being born, that's a recipe for an unhappy population. A lot of these are a recipe for an unhappy population, but this is especially one of them. The next one is education. And now education actually works hand in hand with something else in the domestics here called literacy rate, to directly influence the speed of which and the efficiency of which you research things. So education isn't really going to affect your domestic approval rating too much. It mainly affects your research, and it doesn't have a big economic effect either. Infrastructure is potentially the most important social spending in the entire game. Remember when we looked at the production and spending of resources earlier? Infrastructure is, let's look at this. Let's say you have met all requirements for getting maximum resource production, and I'm not going to go over all of those just now, but infrastructure is another requirement. Let's say all the other requirements are met for max production. Infrastructure is not. If your quality rating for infrastructure is at 54.5%, then if an oil rig that you build tells you it can make a certain amount of barrels every day or year, well, you're not going to make that many barrels. You're going to make this percentage of those barrels. So, getting this to 100% is insanely important and boosts, yes, can boost production even if you go above 100. Although, that's where techs come especially in handy for raising the overall value when you're in the middle of the bar, as opposed to, you see, I can double the spending, but that's going to get me like a 4% boost. So if I have the original values, we're talking 104%, that's not necessarily worth it. Although this does have another effect. There is a system in this game, I'm going to show you, called supply. As you see, there are spaces here where there's not a lot of supply. There's not colored in areas. And there's other ways to look at supply, which I'll cover somewhere else, such as going to your land tab, clicking on a hex, and then seeing the supply value here. The supply value is part of what determines the production of a facility, but most players won't get that in depth. So the most important part for most players would be that supply determines where your units can move, how much they can shoot, whether or not they can even move in an area if they're motorized or mechanized, And there's ways to move supply, and I can make a tutorial about supply and other stuff like that later. As you see, infrastructure affects a lot. It's very, very important, and I want you to know that. But moving on, now we go into environment spending. Environment spending is the amount of money that you have to spend to counteract your pollutive practices, such as coal plants, oil plants, not using hydro and green plants and other plants and things like that, or emissions from vehicles and things like that. This is the amount of money that you have to spend to keep your environment healthy. This has a large effect on your domestic approval rating. This has a large effect on your tourism. This has a large effect on your immigration and your emigration if you're looking at growing population. Next, family subsidy. This is a complement to a good healthcare system. Never prioritize this over a good healthcare system. They both can affect, your population growth and stuff, and your happiness of your population. Family subsidy is a way to bolster down your population growth and to make your population happier as well, because you're saying, hey, right, you have a child, here's some money to help you raise that child. It raises their wealth. And by raising their wealth, you're also giving them more money to spend on goods, which come back to you through direct sales and through sales taxes. You see how complicated this is yet? Law enforcement has a couple of big effects as well. It has a giant effect on your domestic approval rating. Happier citizens, more taxes paid, right? It also makes your country more desirable to immigrants that are looking for somewhere to live. I mean, think about it. Would you want to live somewhere that has a lot of law enforcement spending? Think about it in real life, like the United States, Canada, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, or do you want to go somewhere that doesn't have a lot of law enforcement spending, like most South American and African countries? No offense to anyone that lives there, I'm just talking about immigration rates. You're far more likely to immigrate somewhere like the United States, who has the highest immigration rate of the planet, even while restricting it heavily, and places like Brazil, where their population goes up simply because a lot of people are born there for different reasons. There's not whole hordes of millions and millions of persons out there that are saying, let me move to Brazil. I heard about all the crimes there and now I want to move there. Just so you understand how that works. This also has another effect. When you're at war, or if you have been at war and you've taken territory that is not loyal to you. For example, I've turned on the loyalty map here. This shows areas that are historically claimed by a population within a scenario. If you own areas that are not loyal to you, there's a lot of them we can see over here in the Middle East that get very complex. You can see the actual border lines, and then you can see the loyalties within them. If you own somewhere that is not loyal to you, there are penalties. And the specific penalty we're going to be looking at with law enforcement is the fact that they might spawn guerrillas or partisan units that will fight against you to try to bring their nation back into existence. Which one forms depends on whether or not the nation is in existence. Partisans form if the nation is conquered. Guerrillas form if the nation still exists, but you own some of their land. These partisans and guerrillas will fight your local garrisons if you have any. Otherwise, they will claim the city that they pop out of, and then you'll have to go kill them and reclaim the land. Otherwise, that nation will come back into power, and then that can lead to a bunch of other things. So high law enforcement spending, at least 100%, is very, very important. Cultural subsidies. This has a lot of very important effects, although this is one of the more optional ones, if I had to say any of them were. It has a giant effect on your domestic approval and migration rates. So if you need a higher immigration rate, if you need less emigration from your country, if you want a higher domestic approval rating to try to make more money from your population, or win an election or what have you, this is a very important one to spend on. Social assistance is probably the worst social spending in the entire game. It has a good effect on the domestic approval rating of your country, and it can also raise migration rates and things like that. The point of the tax is that you're taking money and you're giving it to the unemployed, basically. So the higher your unemployment rate, the higher you're going to have to pay for this. However, in this game, for some reason, and there's a mod to fix this, by the way, you can look it up in the workshop if you're curious, the amount of money required for this is retarded. Like, I just changed it and we're already at a deficit, whereas before we weren't even close to a deficit. The amount of money you have to spend on this is crazy. Again, there is a mod to fix this. Usually I avoid this social spending, but I will tell you that it does have an effect on your GDP. It will raise your inflation a little bit, and it has a big effect on your domestic approval rating and your migration rates, and we've already gone over what those affect. And I've now been speaking into this microphone for an hour. I don't know how long the video is by now, but I'm happy to tell you that's it. That is my basic, comprehensive guide on Supreme Ruler Ultimate's economy and financials. If you want any more guides on this game to get you into it, please leave the suggestions in the comments below. I'd love to hear about it, and I'd love to maybe make some more. I already plan on doing a war guide, just in case you feel like suggesting that. I already plan on doing it. I might record it today as well, who knows. These videos are really hard to make, but I hope that they can help some of you learn how to play the game, and I hope you enjoy my other SRU series and things like that. If you want to support me, please check me out on Patreon or join our Gilded Community server, which has a similar system built into it to Patreon, but you can also interact with me there and the rest of the community. Or consider becoming a YouTube channel member as well. Either way, if you pay at least $2 a month, I will put your name in a weekly shout out, and you will gain access to deleted scenes and uncut clips, a whole bunch of nice little benefits. I'll wrap this video up by putting the names of the current supporters up on the screen. Thank you guys very much for watching through this, and I'll see you on the next one.